Welcome back. Probably not surprisingly, there's a lot of misinformation about domestic violence. For example, many people believe that it only happens to poor, uneducated people, where the truth is it's a crime that affects all ages, races, and economic class.
Yeah, and it's also common. A recent Washington Post article said 45% more women were killed by a current or former male partner between 2001 and 2012 than troops were killed in the war in Afghanistan. Take that in for a second.
That's mind-boggling.
Insane. Angela Mancuso is the executive director of the Women's Center, and she's here to clear up some myths about domestic violence and tell you how you can help during this Me Too movement and domestic violence awareness. Good to see you.
Good morning.
Great to see you. So this is the
shocking number.
Yeah.
Awareness. That number probably doesn't surprise you.
No, actually, the last stat I read was that 50% of women are killed by an abusive partner. I mean, domestic violence is one of the leading causes of death of women. It can be likened to heart disease.
Wow.
That's crazy. So when people talk about domestic violence and the Me Too movement, how do they fit together?
Unfortunately, they tie very nicely together because domestic abuse is one of the leading acts of violence against women, and about 2/3 of people who are in a physically abusive relationship are also being sexually assaulted by their partner. So just from the domestic violence perspective, sexual assault and abuse is sort of the ultimate form of exercising power and control over an individual, and it ties into, of course, the physical abuse, but also verbal and emotional abuse.
Yeah, it's just unbelievable. In terms of things that need to change, or if there needs to be a shift in culture, what does it need to be to help the people who are victims of domestic violence?
Everything. You know, I think one thing is we really need to get a grip on just how pervasive domestic violence is. And I think if every domestic violence victim came forward similar to Me Too, you know, so raised their hand and said, yeah, people would be shocked and stunned at the sheer volume. When we're talking about 1 in 4 women and 1 in 7 men will be physically abused by their partner in their lifetime, I mean, that's pretty staggering. But also, there's a lot of stigma and victim blaming and shaming that surrounds domestic violence, and that definitely needs to change.
How can we change the victim blaming? Because, you know, there's times when stories aren't true, and then obviously most of the time stories are true and people aren't listening, or they're blaming the victim, you know, whether it's, you know, you shouldn't have been there, or you shouldn't have dressed that way, or you shouldn't have responded that way, or whatever it is. That's all victim blaming. How do we change that?
Well, it's challenging those kinds of statements. So, you know, instead of saying, why did she stay, why aren't we saying, why did he abuse? And, you know, really supporting survivors, making sure there's resources available to them, but holding perpetrators accountable, and we need to stop accepting their excuses for why they abuse. But there is a lot of education and training that needs to take place. I mean, we need to educate about consent, we need to educate about conflict resolution, coping mechanisms when you don't get your way, love and respect, what a healthy relationship looks like. And we really need to shift the whole thought that violence against women is a norm and should just be expected and tolerated.
One of the things I found fascinating is there was a high-ranking legislator who was accused of battering his wife. And there was a quote in the Washington Post where someone said, I didn't think doctors and lawyers and highly educated people beat their wives. I mean, that is one of, I think, the biggest myths about domestic violence is that educated people of means, it's not happening in those relationships.
Right, and that's a tremendous misperception. It, as you said earlier, it crosses all socioeconomic boundaries. I mean, I see the reports. I can tell you every zip code in every community, including Waukesha, there are domestic violence relationships going on. You know, another really common myth is the abuse must not have been that bad, or you wouldn't have stayed. I mean, and there's lots of reasons why someone would stay with their abuser. Fear being, you know, the largest component. It can be extremely dangerous to leave an abuser, and requires a process. You know, it's not an event, and people just think it should happen just like that, and it's easy to sit in judgment when you're not in that particular dynamic. But also that you know, what did you do to provoke, you know, your partner, which is in essence saying you did something to deserve it.
Your fault again.
Exactly, which is appalling and preposterous. You know, I mean, to use violence in response to conflict or not getting your way is a choice, and it's a choice squarely on the shoulders of the abuser, never the victim.
Are there any other myths that people kind of need to know and break down?
What about the abuser's always a man?
Yeah, right. I mean, there are high incident rates of intimate partner violence in same-sex relationships, and there's caregiver abuse. There's elderly abuse, so and family violence, in between family members.
So what do we do if we suspect that? If somebody's confiding in us, or if we just see something, what do we do?
Well, the first thing we say is, I'm sorry that that's happening to you. What can I do to support you? As opposed to, what did you do to deserve it?
Or you need to leave.
Right, or what were you wearing? Or you should. Should is really, is a word that's very isolating and alienating to victims. But it's, and then saying, how can I help you? And there are resources. I can connect you to, the Women's Center or other organizations. But I think just believing and not judging and not imposing your personal biases or judgments, what you think somebody else should do. I mean, that's, again, one of the greatest ways to put your friend or family member in an even more dangerous situation.
Yeah,
yeah, I think we all do that. It's wonderful. People can get in touch with you online if they go to twcwaukesha.org. That stands for the Women's Center. And then here's the hotline number. If you or someone you know, love, are familiar with, you think is a victim of abuse, you can call and get more information by calling 262-542-3828.
Yeah.
Really great. Thank you so much. We appreciate your time.
Thank you.